Welcome back for episode 27, The Downfall of James II. We begin right as James is crowned king in February of 1685. Everything from there goes progressively downhill for the newly crowned King James II.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
We begin with the day that King James II was crowned. On that day, he gave a short speech to his Privy Council. In this speech, James said, quote, "My lords, before I enter upon any other business, I think fit to say something to you. Since it has pleased Almighty God to place me in this station, I know too that the laws of England are sufficient to make the king as great a monarch as I can wish. And as I shall never depart from the just rights and prerogative of the crown, so I shall never invade any man's property." End quote. Now, I bring this quotation to your attention due to the explicit mention of God in James's very first speech. Actually, he said his rise, quote, "pleased Almighty God." He said this due to the concept of divine right of kings, which asserted that monarchs were born into their position and stature because God willed it to be so. To us, or many of us I should say, such an idea seems ridiculous, and quite frankly, many people within the British Isles during this time period would have agreed. Most saw it as just a matter of tradition to invoke the word of God. Certainly the Lords of Parliament and the bishops of the Anglican Church saw it as a formality, especially considering it was a Catholic that was king in a Protestant country. What is interesting here, though, is that it seems King James was one of those unique monarchs that actually believed he had been destined by God for the crown. And in the story to follow, you will see that James also thought of himself as an absolute monarch, as the Tudors had been, and his strange personal ideology and mindset would soon put his reign in peril and limbo. Before that all happens, allow me to pull back the curtain a little bit so I can talk about the developing power struggles in Europe. The author Benjamin Wise states, quote, "Meanwhile, in continental Europe, Louis XIV of France was having Catholic-Protestant issues. Raised as a Catholic and spurred on by the clergy, Louis had revoked the Edict of Nantes. Its revocation encouraged the persecution and even murder of thousands of French Huguenots." End quote. This was deeply troubling news to everyone in Europe because the Edict of Nantes, which had been enacted in France at the turn of the 17th century, had protected the rights of French Protestants. But its revocation and the violence that followed threatened to destabilize the fragile peace in Europe. The political tension was building fast across Europe in 1685, and it was made all the worse due to the fact that King Louis XIV of France was at the height of his power. Also, the Christian-on-Christian persecutions being conducted in France play into this British tale of revolution for two primary reasons. The first reason is the obvious one that many of you have probably already inferred. The Protestant people of the British Isles were worried that their Catholic king would do the same as King Louis in France. In other words, they feared that if King James II had enough time, he would begin to denigrate the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, and persecute all Protestants in his realms. This was not a ridiculous notion either, considering the recent secret treaties that the crown had had with King Louis, and also taking into account the very possible fear that King Louis might invade England and impose his laws and doctrines on them that way. Little was known, but rumors were now flying in 1685, and the people felt extremely uneasy with a Catholic at the helm of their kingdoms. The second reason has to do with the nations of Europe, in particular the Dutch Republic, the Germanic kingdoms, and the Holy Roman Empire. If you recall from episode 26, the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic is William III, the Prince of Orange. And by the mid-1680s, William of Orange had become the unofficial leader of a coalition of European states against the ambitions of King Louis XIV. This coalition was the League of Augsburg, later known as the Grand Alliance. And it is important to note that the League of Augsburg was made up of Catholic and Protestant nations, which shows how much of a threat everyone considered Louis XIV to be at this time. The reason this is in our story at all, though, is because the nations in the League of Augsburg feared that Catholic King James might ally himself to King Louis XIV. By early 1686, this was beginning to be a great fear in many European courts, and many in the League of Augsburg began to look for a solution. The solution many began to talk silently of involved William of Orange, because William III was third in the line of succession to the English crown, and married to James's Protestant daughter Mary. So the obvious but difficult solution was to simply depose James II in favor of William and Mary, because they were both Protestant and hostile to the tyranny of Louis. In early 1686, however, such an idea was far-fetched at best, a mere fantasy. Moving on, in late 1685 and early 1686, several small rebellions broke out across England and Scotland. None were major, and all were squashed before word spread, and the reason I mention these historical footnotes is because of how James II solidified himself afterwards. James saw his best defense to be his army, but he wanted to ensure he had a loyal army. So James II began to create entirely new regiments. But it turned out that these newly formed units were made up of largely Catholic recruits and led almost entirely by Catholic commanders. This tactic by James II began to ruffle many feathers throughout his government, and those that were vocal in their displeasure were meticulously dispensed and replaced by Catholic supporters of James. This was all within the power of the monarchy, but it was done perhaps too obviously. Nevertheless, James did indeed solidify himself for the next few years, but he also angered many government officials, from local parishes to the members of Parliament themselves. So, quietly and slowly, the list of powerful dissenters to the reign of the Catholic James was growing. Now, let's jump ahead to 1687. After nearly 2 years, tensions were remaining relatively stable across the continent, but the threat of such peace going up in smoke was still very much on the minds of European leaders. What happened next certainly did not help matters. For in the spring of 1687, King James finally ordered his long-feared Declaration of Indulgence. The proclamation declared much, but most importantly, the proclamation granted Catholics and Protestant dissenters, quote, leave to meet and serve God after their own manner, end quote. In the final paragraph of the Declaration of Indulgence, the Crown also demanded one more thing, quote, we do likewise declare from time to time the willing and requiring of our judges, justices, and other officers to take notice and obey our royal will, end quote. So, as of April of 1687, Catholics and Protestant dissenters could not be punished for openly practicing their faith. That was bound to irritate some of the Crown's subjects, but it was quite possible that they could eventually stomach it. The real problem was that he required officials in his realm to obey the command of his royal declaration. Now, it seems obvious to us that everyone should obey law, even if they disagree with it. And the rule of law was very much established in England at this time, but the punishment for disregarding the 1687 Declaration of Indulgence is what interests us. Because if any of his subjects, especially those in government, disregarded the indulgence, King James II, through this decree, had the authority to replace them as he saw fit without any overriding supervision from a court. Yet King James happened to be ignoring previous laws on this very scenario in his kingdoms. Most particularly the Test Act, which was put into place by Parliament after King Charles tried to pass a similar declaration. Ben Wise describes the act as such, quote, the Test Act, passed in 1673 and extended in 1678, stipulated that Catholics, and to some extent nonconformists, were not allowed to hold any governmental position nor serve as officers in the military. End quote. Thus James ruffled many feathers by ignoring or trying to override an act of Parliament. But what enraged the higher social classes of the kingdoms even more was that the king's Declaration of Indulgence was not even passed by a legislative body. He didn't even seek parliamentary approval. Now, how did King James get away with this? Well, he did theoretically have the powers of an absolute monarch, so he did have the authority of office to do such a thing, but in reality, no English monarch had truly had absolute power since the Tudor dynasty, because if a monarch dared to do something tyrannical or seen as such, the people and or parliament would force their king to either submit to popular demand or be executed or exiled. In fact, this very thing had happened with King Charles I and Charles II before James ascended to the crown. That being said, legally speaking, the king and or queen did have the right to pass such a declaration, but not in reality. That still does not answer the question of how King James was able to legalize his Declaration of Indulgence, because Parliament did wield quite a lot of power even in 1687. James was able to get around Parliament, however, through a bit of royal legality, Instead of dissolving Parliament like his brother had, which would please no one and anger many, King James, back in November of 1685, had simply ordered Parliament prorogued. Now, you have probably never heard that word before because I'm fairly sure the word was created to describe these very scenarios. Prorogued is when you forbid a legislative body from meeting, but don't actually dissolve the body itself. That is how and why Parliament never took issue with King James II's policies after November of 1685 because, well, they couldn't. Nonetheless, the response to his Declaration of Indulgence from most of the population was sheer outrage, but not in the form of riots and rebellion. Rather, the outrage was contained and kept quiet because almost no one would take up arms unless they were sure everyone else in England would as well. The form of protest to the royal declaration became negligence. People simply ignored the will of their king. Many high-profile citizens even publicly refused to obey the declaration to the agreement of their subjects, and many even publicly petitioned King James asking for the removal of his declaration. Yet neither side would budge in this moment, and the tensions began to build until the next year on April 27, 1688, when King James republished and reasserted, this time more forcefully, his Declaration of Indulgence. He also added in his message, quote, "Our conduct has been firm and constant, and we think it fit to declare that our intentions have not changed," end quote, thus proclaiming again that his royal will superseded everything in his kingdoms and that he was not changing his mind. His subjects were now getting another harsh example that their Catholic king was attempting to wield the power of absolute monarchy. The next month, May of 1688 for those keeping track, James demanded that all priests, bishops, and officials of the Church of England or any other faith post his declaration across his kingdoms and read it aloud to their congregations. Now this is when events began to happen in rapid succession as the summer of 1688 began. The archbishops of the Anglican Church responded immediately that they had read and acknowledged his Declaration of Indulgence but would not agree to it because they believed it legally unjust. This has become known as the Petition of the 7 Bishops, and here is the argument of the bishops. Quote, "The declaration is founded upon such a dispensing power as hath often been declared illegal by Parliament, and the matter is of so great moment and consequence, both in church and state, that your petitioners cannot, in prudence, make themselves parties to the distribution of it all over the kingdoms." End quote. The bishops wrote this to King James II on May 18, 1688, within a week of receiving the crown's demands. The reaction of King James was one of fury. As was often the case, his spontaneous reaction resulted in poor decision-making. James had the 7 bishops tried for seditious libel and locked in the Tower of London until their trial. Massive crowds assembled in London pleading for the release of the Anglican bishops, but the king would not yield. Many of his advisors during this time even tentatively suggested that he had perhaps gone too far this time. The crowds were disassembled for a time, but on June 10, 1688, one of the worst timed births occurred in history. King James II had a son, baptized Catholic, and fears of a Catholic dynasty ruling England seemed assured. The people went into a frenzy and anti-Catholic sentiment was at an all-time high. The royal family began to fear for their lives as the Lords of Parliament feared for the future of their country. The crowds did not quit for the rest of the month. They were waiting for the verdict on the trial of the 7 bishops. The judges decreed on June 30, 1688, that the bishops were acquitted on the charges of seditious libel to cheers from massive crowds of Londoners as they left the Tower of London as free men. The fearful King James now desired the full support of his nation's armies, and there is a passage written by Winston Churchill that details how the king reacted to the popular support given for the released bishops. Churchill wrote, quote, "The king had visited the army at Hounslow, and as he departed heard loud cheering. 'What is that clamor?' the king asked. 'Sire, it is nothing. The soldiers are glad that the bishops are acquitted.' 'Do you call that nothing?' said James. And indeed, James II was right, because later on the same day of June 30th, 7 of the party leaders of England gathered together to write and send off a treasonous document, the Invitation to the Prince of Orange, signed by an anonymous group of powerful men that are referred to as the 7. After the Revolution, their names would come out openly, and the 7 signatories were the Earl of Shrewsbury, Earl of Devonshire, Earl of Danby, Lord Lumley, the Bishop of London, the future Earl of Orford, and the future Earl of Romney. Here's a bit of their invitation, quote, "The people are so generally dissatisfied with the present conduct of the government in relation to their religion, liberties, and properties that your highness may be assured that 19 parts of 20 people are desirous of a change and would be willing to contribute." End quote. Once the letter reached the court of William III in the Dutch Republic, the fate of European peace and the fate of the British monarchy was in the balance. And after much deliberation, the Prince of Orange finally responded, now known as the Declaration of the Prince of Orange, given on September 30th, 1688. William responded, quote, "We cannot any longer forbear to declare that, to our great regret, we see that those councillors and the king have overturned the religion, laws, and liberties of these realms and subjected them to all things. Therefore, we have thought fit to go over to England and to carry a force sufficient, by the blessing of God, to defend us from the violence of those evil councillors, and we think fit to declare that this our expedition is intended for no other design but to have free and lawful Parliament assembled." End quote. William then went on to invite and persuade all peers of the realm to his cause. Okay, now that William has declared his intention to invade James II's domains, let's take a step back. One could very well say that the English Revolution of 1688 had begun that day when William finally issued his response, but would that be correct? Certainly you could make a strong case for it, but let's analyze that important question for a little bit. Did the Glorious Revolution officially begin on September 30th, 1688, when William declared his intentions? Or did it begin earlier, or perhaps later when William's invasion first set sail or first set foot on English soil? Or perhaps this question is just unnecessary. Many historical questions certainly do seem useless, and sometimes are, but this one I think is important. It is important to distinguish, or at least think about, when exactly any revolution began. The answer is often not clear, but that is often not the point of history, and it is certainly not the point of this question. The point of such a question of beginnings has to do with comprehension and stimulation. Comprehension meaning how you or anyone understands the narrative of the English Revolution, and stimulation in this context means engaging with the material. In this case, the story of the Glorious Revolution. By asking this question, and many others, we enhance our levels of comprehension and stimulation. Sometimes. For some people, it does nothing, and that's okay too. But for the rest of us, let's rest a moment on the lone question of when did the Glorious Revolution begin? You might certainly have your own inferences already, but I'll run through some options. A romantic might say that the revolution began the moment James II took the throne. Certainly many pre-modern historians seem to say this. Or perhaps the romantic would choose the moment when William finally set sail for England. Those intrigued by the social aspect of the story might assert that the revolution had begun subtly with James II's Declaration of Indulgence. My own story highlights that document, but understand that my use of that declaration as a story-building and explanatory tool may disturb or bias your own judgment on this question. And a political historian might state that the beginning was when the Seven issued their invitation to William, or when James locked up the bishops in the Tower of London. And one thing that I would note is that a definite turning point was when James II birthed a son, baptized Catholic, during the early summer of 1688. Yet, I don't know the answer. No one truly knows it exactly, but we can make educated guesses. And I'll leave you with that. And when I return with episode 28, William's invasion will commence and James will attempt to gather his own forces. How much blood will be shed? How will the people react to either William or James? Find out next time on Everything History.
Thank you very much.